All right, so last time we had looked at some of the early explorers that came to Pennsylvania. We talked about why they came here as well. So some of their main motivations were to get rich, to get famous. Okay? But today we're going to look at some of the first people that started to settle and establish Pennsylvania. And so we're going to start here on page 24, if you're following along with me in the ebook. And if you're not right now, that's okay too, if you're just listening. But our first settlement in Pennsylvania, the main idea says that New Sweden was the first community in what is present-day Pennsylvania. So the Swedish, we talked about the Dutch last time setting up a trading post, but the first people that actually made a permanent community in Pennsylvania were people from Sweden. Okay. Sweden is a country in Europe. It's a country in the far northern part of Europe, along with Norway and Finland. So it's called a Scandinavian country. Those three countries together are called Scandinavia. But Sweden is where those first people to Pennsylvania came from. And they came here in 1638. So let's go ahead and start with that. In 1638, people from Sweden became the first Europeans to make a permanent settlement around the Delaware River. A settlement is a community of people living in a new place. The colony of New Sweden included what is present-day Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. So it was in the southeast corner of Pennsylvania, around where Philadelphia was, and it included parts of New Jersey and Delaware as well. So here's a map that shows where New Sweden would have been. Okay. Now, a colony, it says, is a settlement ruled by a distinct country. A lot of you know that America started as 13 British colonies, or the 13 original colonies you may have heard of before. Well, that's because when we were the 13 colonies, England was still in charge. England was a faraway country, but they were the ones making the rules. They were the ones making the laws for us. So we were a colony of England. But before we were a colony of England, part of Pennsylvania was actually a colony of Sweden. So that's what we're talking about here. Even though Sweden is far away, they were in control of that part of Pennsylvania. And it's just that small part of Pennsylvania that was considered New Sweden. It wasn't the whole state, or at least the whole state as we know it today. People who came to New Sweden hunted wildlife in the area, particularly beaver. Beaver skins were used to make hats that were very popular in Europe. Now, why would beaver skins make such popular clothing? Well, in Europe, beaver had actually been hunted nearly to extinction at this point. So they had been killed off in a lot of cases. But in America, there were still plenty of beaver everywhere. So what made beaver such a quality fur for clothing, for hats especially, but also in some cases for shawls or coats? Think about where beavers spend most of their time. They live in the water. Okay? They're a water animal. So a beaver's fur and skin repels that water naturally, almost like if you've ever watched a duck and the way the water rolls off of a duck's back. Well, it's the same kind of thing. That beaver fur was a natural water repellent. It was naturally waterproof. So if you were wearing a hat made of beaver fur in the rain, it would repel that water. It wouldn't soak through the hat as easily. So it made it a very popular skin in addition to being warm. Okay. A Swedish military leader named Johan Prince became governor of New Sweden. Prince worked to set up boundaries for the colony. He also set up the capital of New Sweden at Tinicum Island. Tinicum Island is now part of present-day Pennsylvania, and it's just off where Philadelphia is. It's in the Delaware River, so that's where Tinicum Island is located. And you can look that up actually on Google Earth. I believe it's called Little Tinicum Island now if you're looking it up there. But that's where the first capital was in Pennsylvania. It was the capital of New Sweden. It was set up by Johan Prince. Prince's daughter Armagut Prince helped her father buy the island from the Dutch. So again, the Dutch were here first. They had some trading posts and things, but the Swedish wanted to make a more permanent community. Swedish settlers in the new land brought with them the culture and customs of their homeland. For example, many settlers built traditional Swedish log cabins. These buildings had sloped roofs, small windows, and walls made of logs stacked on top of one another. Several early Swedish log cabins remain in Pennsylvania today, and there's a picture of one in your book, and I'm going to put that picture up here just so we can see it a little more clearly and in color. But that cabin was built in 1640 by Swedish colonists near present-day Clifton Heights, Pennsylvania. Now, 1640 is almost 400 years ago, 380 years ago, that cabin was built. And it's still there. That's amazing. So that just shows kind of the quality of this kind of structure. But a lot of people think of a log cabin and they think, oh, it's an American log cabin. Well, it's not. The reason it's an American log cabin goes back to that main idea from yesterday, or the build on what you know rather from yesterday. When people came to Pennsylvania from other places, they brought their culture and customs with them. So this is a traditional Swedish way of building a home, and it was an easy thing to do. Pennsylvania was covered with forest. Okay? Completely covered with forest when these people arrived. So in order to build an area anyway to live, you had to cut down trees. You had to clear land for a farm. So if you're cutting down those trees anyway, it makes sense to build them into your house and to use them to make your house. So that's what was happening here. Okay? And then other settlers would come later, they'd see those log cabins and they'd say, that's pretty smart. Let's build a house like that. So the log cabin became something that was associated with America, but it became that because of the Swedes that settled here in Pennsylvania first. Okay. Now, before we move on, I want to go a little more in depth here with what we were just talking about with New Sweden and with these log cabins and with Johan Prince as well. So I have another book. I don't have the physical copy of the book with me, but I do have some of the digital pages here. So I have another Pennsylvania history book that I sometimes like to pull from. And so let's take a closer look here at New Sweden, the log cabins, and Johan Prince, the leader of New Sweden. It says here, the log cabin. New Sweden was a small colony. Only a few hundred people lived there. It lasted less than 20 years. But a clever Swedish way of building spread all over America and lasted hundreds of years. When settlers arrived in New Sweden, the first thing they did was build houses just like they had in Sweden. First, they cut down trees with axes. Then they chopped notches into the ends of the logs and stacked them up to make walls. They filled the spaces between the logs with clay. A roof finished the cabin. Inside the log cabins, there was a fireplace, a table, a bench, and beds. Later, English, German, and Scots-Irish settlers throughout thought the cabins looked rough or crude. They had to admit, though, that log cabins made warm shelters from the cold. Log cabins were also easy to build. Settlers did not need nails or other tools, only an axe. They learned from the Swedes how to build log cabins. When they moved west out of the Delaware Valley, they built log cabins wherever they went. Today, everyone thinks log cabins are American, but one original cabin in eastern Pennsylvania proves that it all started with the Swedes. So, the Swedish log cabin, like we said. And then to talk a little bit more about Johan Prince, because he was a pretty interesting guy. Johan Prince. Later, Sweden sent Johan Prince to govern New Sweden. He was a very large man. He stood about 7 feet tall and weighed about 400 pounds. Now just imagine that. If mom or dad or grandma or papa, whoever you're with, if somebody has a tape measure, grab a tape measure and measure out 7 feet. That's a rare height even for a person today. And back then, with nutrition not being very good, I believe the average height of a full-grown man at that time was closer to like 5'3", 5'4", somewhere in there. So a 7 foot tall person would kind of naturally get your attention when he came into the room or when he was around. So he kind of became a natural leader just due to his size. And then the fact that he was 400 pounds and 7 feet tall, he would be a very imposing figure to see. So Johan Prince, and like I said, if you can imagine 7 feet, get that tape measure and see how tall that is. That's about 1.5 feet higher than I am, I think, or not quite, but over a foot taller than I am. He built a fort at what is now Chester, close to where Philadelphia is now. He wanted to let the Dutch know that the Swedes were here to stay. The fort became the first permanent European settlement on Pennsylvania soil. While he helped the colony in many ways, the colonists became unhappy with Prince and his leadership. They thought he was too strict. Prince grew tired of his life in the wilderness, so he returned to Sweden. And there's one other caption here with that photo of Johan Prince. Johan Prince helped New Sweden grow quickly. He set up the capital of New Sweden at Tinicum Island. Today, a state park there is named for him. So there is a Johan Prince State Park that's named in his honor near Philadelphia. Okay, so that's Johan Prince in New Sweden. We're going to go back to our main book here now. Okay. And our next little subheading there says struggles for the colony. Struggles. Ooh, there must be conflict. There must be some disagreements. What's going on? Well, let's find out. Struggles for the colony. The Swedish and the Dutch began to struggle for control of the land in the northeastern part of the Americas. Dutch leader PeterStuyvesant encouraged settlers in New Netherland to take over Swedish land. New Netherland was a Dutch colony in present-day New York. In 1655, New Sweden became part of New Netherland. So New Netherland took control of New Sweden. New Sweden kind of surrendered and decided to give their land up to the Dutch. So PeterStuyvesant took control. PeterStuyvesant allowed Swedish colonists to continue making their own laws, even though their land was part of New Netherland. So he allowed the Swedes that wanted to stay there, to keep living there, and to make their own rules and set up their own laws. So that was very generous of him. He wouldn't have had to do that. They continued to do so until 1681, when Pennsylvania became a separate colony. And that's what we're going to be talking about in our next lesson next time. But just like I have more information about Johan Prince in New Sweden, I also have more information about PeterStuyvesant and New Netherland. Okay? And if you thought Johan Prince was interesting, wait until we talk about Peter. Soon the Dutch grew worried that the Swedes were farming and trading on Dutch land. Both groups wanted to trade with the Indians. A new Swedish governor decided to attack the Dutch fort and take over the fur trade. That was a bad mistake. PeterStuyvesant, the governor of New Netherlands, sent troops to the fort to destroy New Sweden. When the Swedes saw the troops, they surrendered without a fight. PeterStuyvesant did not have to destroy New Sweden. In fact, he let the colonists stay on their farms, even though the Dutch now ruled. So basically, the Dutch didn't mind the Swedes living there, but the Dutch wanted to have control. They wanted to be the ones in charge of trade and in charge of the land. So they wanted to be the ones that were basically had the rights to trade with the Native Americans that were here. The English take control. For the next 10 years, the Dutch and Swedes worked together peacefully. Then another country stepped in. England said it had claimed that land before the Dutch or Swedes ever came. The King of England sent his brother James to take control. James sailed into New Netherlands and told Old Silvernails to surrender. Now, we'll talk about Old Silvernails here in a second, but that was PeterStuyvesant. That was his nickname. The Dutch were not happy, but James had brought a fleet of English warships with him. Their huge guns stood aimed at the bay. Old Silvernails wanted to fight, but the colonists did not want any bloodshed. They were tired of his unfair rules. He had to surrender. Once again, the land along the Delaware River changed hands without a shot being fired. James raised England's flag over the new settlement. He gave the city of New Amsterdam a new name, New York. Now all the land along the Atlantic coast belonged to England. So this area in Pennsylvania was one of the few spots that England didn't have control of for a while. And then eventually England decided, we want that too. We're just going to say that's ours too. And England had a very powerful army, very powerful navy. So really the Dutch didn't have much of a chance against them, so they surrendered. The picture here of PeterStuyvesant, if you can see it, right there he is. There's a great caption here. PeterStuyvesant, the leader of the Dutch colony, was known as a grouchy man who made unfair rules. His nickname was Old Silvernails because he had a wooden leg with silver nails all over it. Now, I have one more story about PeterStuyvesant. A few years ago, my wife and I were lucky enough to take a Disney cruise. Okay, you guys know I love Disney. So we took a Disney cruise. And that Disney cruise sailed to an island in the Caribbean Sea called St. Martin. St. Martin is a Dutch island. Okay? There's actually part of it that's Dutch and part of it that is French. So when we arrived in St. Martin and we got off the ship and we walked through the port, there's this statue. And I said, "Oh my gosh, that's PeterStuyvesant." My wife had never heard of PeterStuyvesant, so she thought I was crazy. But PeterStuyvesant, I had been reading about him in Pennsylvania history for years, and all of a sudden here, hundreds of miles away from Pennsylvania, I see this statue and I recognized it right away. And there's PeterStuyvesant standing there. Now, I mentioned that he had a wooden leg, and I believe this was actually around the time he got the wooden leg is during his time around St. Martin. So he had his leg shot off by a cannonball during a battle, and then it was replaced with a wooden leg. And from there on, he became known as not only Old Silvernails, because he pounded the silver nails into his leg, but he also became known as Peg Leg Pete. And you may have heard that nickname before. It's a name that a lot of people associate with pirates and things. Peg Leg Pete was actually PeterStuyvesant. Okay, so there was this statue, and I was really curious about what on earth this statue was doing here. So there was a plaque on the statue, okay, and it reads, getting too big here. PeterStuyvesant was the last governor of the Dutch colony of New Netherland, which is now known as New York, from 1646 until its surrender to the English in 1664. Now, PeterStuyvesant and New Netherland extended not only through Pennsylvania, but up into New York as well. So New York, because it's New York City, is a little more famous as being formerly known as New Netherland. And New York City was New Amsterdam. Amsterdam was the capital of the Netherlands. So he was the last governor of the Dutch colony of New Netherland from 1646 until its surrender to the English in 1664. He's actually buried in New York City as well. He was born in the Dutch province of Friesland in 1611 or 1612. After studying language and philosophy for 2 years at the University of Franeker, he joined the Dutch West India Company. In 1638, he was sent to Curaçao. He was appointed the commercial director in 1642, and in 1644 he received orders to recapture St. Martin, which had been taken from the Dutch by the Spanish in 1633. The island was important for its valuable salt production and as a strategic harbor. So there again we see those valuable spices like salt that people can get from places like St. Martin. With a fleet of 13 ships, Stuyvesant set sail to St. Martin. He landed at Key Bay on March 20th, 1644, and made camp at Key Hill. A summons was dispatched to the Spanish garrison at the fort, while a delegation under Stuyvesant's command climbed the battery on Belleair Hill to plant their flag. The Spanish, spotting them from the fort, fired a cannon in their direction. Stuyvesant was severely wounded in his right leg by the shot. He was taken back aboard his ship, De Blauw Haan, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, where his leg was amputated, cut off from the knee down. A wooden stump later served as a replacement, and from then on he was nicknamed Peg Leg Pete. The battle continued until April 17th, 1644, so it was a battle that lasted for nearly a month, at which time the Dutch, being unable to defeat the Spanish, returned to Curaçao. PeterStuyvesant is remembered in history for his wooden leg, as well as being a tough, valiant, hard-headed, and dictatorial leader. He went on to sternly govern the Dutch settlers of New Netherland as a father over his children. He surrendered New Netherland to the British in 1664. Stuyvesant continued to live in New York as a private citizen until his death in 1672. His tombstone can be viewed at St. Mark's Cemetery in the Bowery section in New York City. So some pretty cool information that I learned about Peter Stuyvesant on my vacation a few years ago. And that just goes to show you, always be aware of history when you're traveling. If you happen to go somewhere, there's always history information. I always like to know what happened here. What's the history of this place? So look around, find those statues, and take the time to pause. Before I went to the beach, it was nice to be able to pause and read that information and learn a little more about Peter Stuyvesant, who I never expected to find on my trip. So pretty cool information there. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I will wrap up there for today. Thanks for watching as always. I'll see you next time.